The ruins did not look like anything worth stopping for. They were just rocks, really. Blackened slabs of what used to be stone walls, cracked apart by the artillery strikes that had ended the Drivari Civil War 14 months ago. The whole colony site was dead. The scanners confirmed it every shift. Nothing alive in Grid 7. Nothing alive in Grid 8. Move on, file the report, drink the cold coffee back at the outpost, and do it again tomorrow. Sergeant Darian Cole had done exactly that for 22 days in a row. He was on his way back from the far end of the sweep when his boot caught on something. He looked down. A piece of broken stone, same as everything else out here. He kicked it aside and kept walking. The sky above Driven 4 was the color of old bruises, purple and dark green where the twin moons sat low on the horizon. The air smelled like ash and sulfur and something metallic that he had stopped noticing after the first week. He was 30 meters from the edge of Grid 7 when he heard it. He stopped. The sound was small, so small that on any other day, with wind moving or boots crunching louder on the gravel, he would have missed it entirely. But the evening was still. The ruins were quiet. And the sound came again, a thin, dry scraping, like something dragging against stone. Not wind. Not settling debris. Something that was trying. Darian did not draw his weapon. He stood still for 3 full seconds, listening. Then he turned and walked back into the ruins. The collapsed nesting cradles were the worst part of the colony site to look at. The Drivari built their egg cradles from carved volcanic rock, big circular bowls sunk into the ground, each one designed to hold a clutch of eggs and keep them warm through the hatching season. Most of the cradles in this grid were smashed flat. A few were cracked open from the inside, which meant the eggs had hatched before the strikes. Those hatchlings had probably died in the fighting along with their parents. Most of the eggs were long cold. Darian moved between the broken cradles, following the sound. It led him to the far corner of the grid, where one large slab of wall had fallen at an angle against a low shelf of rock. It made a narrow, dark triangle of shelter underneath. He crouched down and turned on his scanner light. 3 pairs of eyes looked back at him. He did not move. He did not speak. He just looked at them. They were small. Nowhere near the size he would have expected from the Drivari adults he had seen during peacekeeping operations. Those creatures stood 4 meters at the shoulder and could flatten a vehicle with one sweep of their tail. These 3 were barely the size of large dogs, maybe a little bigger. Their scales were dull and dry, not the bright metallic sheen he had seen in the military files. Their wings were folded tight against their bodies. They were pressed together in the deepest corner of the shelter, sharing each other's warmth because there was nothing else to share it with. 2 of them flinched back when his light hit them. The third one did not flinch. The third one looked straight at him. It was the smallest of the 3, which was remarkable because all 3 of them were already very small and very thin. Its scales were the dark gray of cooling ash. Its eyes were gold, too big for its face, and it looked at him the way exhausted things look when they have run out of energy to be afraid. Darian pulled out his scanner and ran a quiet sweep. The results came back in seconds. 3 Drivari hatchlings, approximately 14 days post-hatching. Condition: malnourished, mild fever signatures, early-stage dehydration. Estimated time remaining without intervention, between 40 and 90 hours, depending on the night temperature drop. Then the second line of text appeared below the medical data, auto-generated by the Accord field regulation system that ran inside every peacekeeping scanner. He had seen that line before. He had never had reason to think hard about it. Accord Field Regulation 7C. War Orphan Drivari hatchlings are subject to clan abandonment protocols and are to be treated as outside the scope of Accord intervention. Personnel are advised not to interfere with internal Drivari cultural practice. He read it twice. Then he looked back at the hatchlings. The small one with the gold eyes was still looking at him. It made a sound. Not a roar. Not a hiss. Not anything threatening. It was a small, rough sound, somewhere between a scrape and a note, and the translation chip in his earpiece was silent. The sound was too simple, too basic, not structured enough to be processed as language. But Darian had been a soldier for 11 years, and he had heard things that translation chips could not catch before. He had heard it in field hospitals. He had heard it from people who did not speak his language and did not need to. He knew what that sound was. He turned off the scanner. He shrugged his rifle off his shoulder and set it carefully to the side, within easy reach but out of the way. He unzipped his outer jacket, the heavy thermal layer he wore for night sweeps, and spread it flat on the ground beside him. Then he reached into the shelter, slowly, without sudden movement, and he picked up the smallest one first. It was lighter than he expected. It trembled when he lifted it, but it did not bite, and it did not scratch. It pressed its flat, narrow head against his chest as soon as he tucked it into the fold of the jacket. The other two made sounds then, higher, sharper, alarmed. He talked to them quietly while he worked, the same low, even tone he used to calm down panicked privates, and one by one he gathered them out of the shelter and wrapped them together in the jacket. He fashioned a carry sling with the jacket's long sleeves tied across his chest, the way he had once seen a medic carry an injured child out of a collapsed building on a very different planet in a very different war. He picked up his rifle. He turned toward the outpost. Then he started walking. He was already composing the conversation he was going to have with his commanding officer. It was not going to be a good conversation. He knew that. He had known it the moment he turned off the scanner and put the regulations somewhere in the back of his mind where he did not have to look at them directly. The small one with the gold eyes was asleep against his chest before he reached the edge of the grid. He walked faster. The night was cold and getting colder, and the outpost lights were just visible in the distance, two pale yellow squares against the dark. Behind him, the ruins were quiet again. In front of him, something that was going to be complicated was just beginning. Darian Cole did not think of himself as someone who did dramatic things. He fixed problems when they were in front of him. He did his job. He filed his reports. He was going to have a hard time explaining this one. He walked on through the dark, three hatchlings wrapped in his jacket and pressed against his chest, and somewhere in the back of his mind, below all the logistics and the regulations and the coming argument with his commanding officer, something that had been tight and quiet for a long time loosened, just slightly. He did not notice it yet. He would, later. For now, he just walked. The first thing Corporal Ida said when Darian walked through the outpost door was, "Whatever that is, put it back." The second thing she said was, "Is it breathing?" And by the third thing she said, which was a detailed and colorful description of every regulation he had just broken and what it was going to do to his service record, she was already on her knees with a med scanner in one hand and a thermal blanket pulled from the emergency kit in the other, and her hands were very steady, because Ida's hands were always steady when something needed them to be. Private Rail had been cleaning his sidearm at the small table in the corner. He had stopped doing that the moment Darian came through the door. He stood now with the cleaning cloth still in his hand, staring at the three small shapes being carefully unwrapped from Darian's jacket onto the outpost floor. "Are those," Rail said slowly, "dragon babies?" "Hatchlings," Darian said. "Right," Rail said. "Dragon babies." Ida ran the scanner over each one in turn, her mouth pressed into a flat line that Darian had learned to read as focused rather than angry, or sometimes both at the same time. She called out numbers, and he relayed them to her tablet, and for a few minutes the outpost was full of quiet medical efficiency. The hatchlings allowed themselves to be handled. They were too tired to do much else. The smallest one, the one with the gold eyes, kept its gaze fixed on Darian from wherever Ida placed it, tracking him with the patient attention of something that had decided he was the important thing in the room and was not going to lose track of him. "Dehydrated," Ida said. "All three. The smallest one has a fever. Not dangerous yet, but if they'd spent another night out there in the cold." She stopped. She did not finish the sentence. She opened the emergency nutrition stores and began reading labels, cross-checking them against Drivari physiology files on her tablet. This is going to be complicated. Their dietary requirements are nothing like ours. Can we manage it? With what we have here? Short term, yes. Long term, we're going to need resupply. She looked up at him. Which means we're going to need to file a report. I know. Which means command is going to know about this. I know. Which means someone very senior is going to call you and use a very unhappy voice. I know, Ida. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back down at the hatchlings. "Rail, stop staring and get me the secondary thermal unit from the storage locker. And the water processor. Set it to mineral balance mode. There's a Drivari setting buried in the menu." Rail went to do that. On his way back, he crouched down near the hatchlings to set the equipment beside Ida, and the largest of the three, dark-scaled, quick-eyed, leaned forward and sniffed his hand. Rail went completely still. "It's just curious," Darian said. "I know, Rail breathed out slowly. It's really small. They all are. Can I? Don't name them. Rail looked at him. I wasn't going to. He absolutely was going to. Darien could see it happening already in the way Rail was looking at them. That particular kind of attention that people gave things they were already mentally keeping. He decided not to fight that battle tonight. He had bigger battles coming. He sat down at the comm station and filed the incident report. He wrote it plainly, the way he wrote all his reports. What happened, when, current status, action taken. He did not editorize. He did not add context or justification. Facts in, facts out. He attached the scanner data and the medical readings and sent it up the chain. Then he waited. It took 11 minutes. Lieutenant Governor Vasa appeared on the comm screen, looking like someone who had been woken from a sound sleep by extremely unwelcome news, which was accurate. Vasa was crawly, six-limbed, exoskeletal, with a pale blue-green shell and a face that expressed emotion primarily through the angle of his upper appendages. All four of his upper appendages were currently angled in a way that communicated profound discomfort. Sergeant Cole, he said. Sir, I have read your report. Yes, sir. I want to be certain I understand it. Vasa's translation chip made his voice slightly flat, but the weight behind the words came through fine. You entered Grid 7 during a routine sweep, located 3 living Drivari hatchlings of war orphan status, and rather than logging them as beyond accord intervention per Regulation 7C, you transported them to your outpost and are currently providing them medical care. That's correct, sir. A pause. You are aware that the Drivari Elder Council takes the practice of abandonment very seriously. That interference by Accord personnel could be interpreted as a cultural violation. That we are currently in a delicate ceasefire period in which the Drivari clan factions are still very much capable of. They were alive, sir, Darien said. I brought them in. That's my report. Vasa was quiet. Behind Darien, Rail was very quietly offering a small piece of nutrient paste to the bold, dark-scaled hatchling, which was examining it with great seriousness. I see, Vasa said finally. He was still for a long moment. All 6 appendages arranged in a configuration Darien had come to associate with a particular kind of thinking, the kind that looked for a door that was not the obvious one. I will need time to review the applicable regulations before this incident is formally logged with the Council Oversight System. How much time, sir? Another pause. I would estimate approximately 72 hours. Darien did not smile. He kept his face neutral and professional. Understood, sir. I'll make sure we have a full status update ready for you by then. See that you do. Vasa's upper appendages shifted, a slight change in angle that might, on a crawly, have been something close to resignation. And Sergeant, I do not need to tell you that Accord outpost resources are limited, and that the care of 3 non-human dependents of unknown political status will place a strain on your supply chain. We'll manage, sir. I am sure you will. Humans generally do. The screen went dark. Darien turned back to the room. The bold hatchling had eaten the piece of nutrient paste and was now sitting on Rail's boot, which Rail appeared to find deeply satisfying. The quieter one, gray-silver scaled, had moved close to Ida and was pressed against her knee while she worked. The smallest one, gold-eyed, had crossed the entire length of the floor without Darien noticing and was now sitting approximately 6 centimeters from his foot, looking up at him. Rail looked up. I was thinking, Cole, for the dark one, because of the color, and Flint for the quiet one, because Flint is gray and also kind of tough-looking. He paused. And Ash for the little one. I told you not to name them. You told me not to. You didn't say I couldn't think about it. Darien looked down at the small one, at Ash, who was still watching him with those big gold eyes. The fever had come down a little already, just from the warmth of the outpost, and the first round of hydration Ida had managed to get into them. Ash, he said quietly, testing the shape of it. The small one made that sound again. The one that did not translate. The one that did not need to. Darien crouched down to its level. He did not reach out. He just made himself small and still, the way you did with things that were deciding whether or not to trust you. Ash reached out and touched the back of his hand with one small, dry foreclaw. Then it pulled the claw back and kept watching him. Darien stayed crouched there for a while. In the corner, Rail was whispering to Cole. Ida was making careful notes in her medical log. The outpost was warm. Outside, the ruins of Driven 4 were dark and cold and empty. In here, Something was different. Something had shifted, the way the air in a room shifts when a window gets opened for the first time in a very long season. None of them said so. Soldiers did not say things like that. But none of them were in a hurry to go to sleep, either. By the 5th day, Cole had figured out how to open the supply cabinet. He had not figured out how to close it, which meant Rail discovered the situation at 0600 when he walked into the main room to find the cabinet hanging open and Cole sitting in the middle of the floor surrounded by 3 nutrient paste packets, 1 emergency thermal blanket that had been fully unrolled and was now nested in, and a pair of Rail's boot insoles, which Cole appeared to have relocated out of pure interest rather than any specific plan. Rail stood there for a long moment. Cole looked at him. Rail looked at Cole. Rail sat down on the floor, cross-legged, and accepted this development. It was that kind of week. They settled into a rhythm that none of them had planned and none of them would have predicted. Ida ran health checks every morning and made notes in a Drivari physiology file that was getting longer and more detailed every day. Rail handled feeding, which was a significant job because all 3 hatchlings were eating as if they intended to make up for the 14 days they had spent starving, and managing the Outpost's limited nutrition stores required actual rationing creativity. Darian handled the logistics, the daily reports to Vasa, the careful tracking of resources, the quiet management of what was becoming a complicated situation. He also handled Ash, though he never said so in those terms. Ash followed him. That was simply what happened. Wherever Darian went in the outpost, the comm station, the equipment bay, the small rest area in the back, Ash was somewhere nearby. Not always touching, not always demanding attention, just present, in the way a shadow was present, steady and consistent, and right there at the edge of your awareness. On the 5th evening, Darian sat at the comm station writing his daily report, and Ash sat on the desk beside the terminal, watching his hands move across the input board. After a while, Ash reached out and pressed one claw very carefully against the surface of the board. A string of random characters appeared on screen. Ash pulled the claw back and looked at the screen, then looked at Darian, then looked at the screen again. No, Darian said. Ash made the small sound, the untranslatable one. Still no. Ash settled back and continued to watch. On the 6th day, the Outpost translation suite, which Ida had been patiently training on samples of Drivari hatchling vocalization and body language, produced its first usable outputs. They were rough. The suite was built for adult Drivari diplomatic language, not young hatchlings communicating in pure instinct and body signal. But Ida had spent 3 evenings pairing behavioral observations with known Drivari emotional states from the xenobiology database, and slowly, imperfectly, a picture was forming. She called Darian over in the afternoon and showed him her notes without saying anything. He read them standing at the table. The first entry was from day 3. Cole, bold and curious and almost aggressively social, had a primary behavioral pattern that translated roughly to assertion. He was always moving toward things, testing edges, establishing presence. Normal for a dominant hatchling, the xenobiology notes confirmed. Flint, the quiet gray-silver one, had a pattern that translated to monitoring. He watched everything, processed it slowly, and moved toward warmth and stability when available. Also within normal range for a secondary hatchling. But it was the 3rd entry that Darian read twice. Ash's primary behavioral pattern, logged across 6 days of observations, did not match any standard hatchling category. Ida had written a note beside it in plain language rather than clinical terms, because the clinical terms had not quite covered it. Ash repeatedly orients towards Sergeant Cole at moments of uncertainty. When Cole is visible, Ash's stress markers decrease significantly. When Cole leaves the room, Ash moves to the nearest vantage point where the door is visible and waits. Below that, Ida had written one more line. It was the thing Darian had to read twice, the thing he was still reading when he became aware that he had been standing at that table for longer than made sense. She had written, Translation approximation of Ash's first vocalization upon Cole's return from yesterday's perimeter sweep. Query structure, uncertainty register, best fit. You came back. Darian set the tablet down. He stood there for a moment, doing nothing in particular. Through the door of the main room, he could see Rail arguing cheerfully with Cole about a piece of equipment Cole had decided to sit on. He could hear Flint making small sounds somewhere near Ida's bunk. He picked the tablet back up and kept reading. Flint's communication pattern had produced two approximations. The first was logged from day 4, when Ida had been treating a small scrape on Flint's foreleg. Sustained proximity to Cole and Corporal Ida. Low register vocalization, posture indicating. The translation suite had offered several options here, and Ida had picked the most consistent, seeking. Then it noted, when Ida stopped moving toward him, Flint pressed against her knee and produced a single vocalization with no recognizable Drivari adult equivalent. Closest approximation after cross-reference. Will you leave when you are done? Darian closed the file. He walked into the main room. Cole was still on Rail's equipment. Flint was near Ida's corner. Ash was on the desk by the comms terminal, sitting in the precise spot Darian had been sitting before he went to read the medical log. And when Darian came through the door, Ash's head came up immediately, and the stress markers that Ida had been tracking, the tight wing fold, the slight scale tension along the spine, released all at once. Darian pulled out his chair and sat down. Ash shifted 3 centimeters closer along the desk without appearing to make a decision about it. Darian had spent 11 years in uniform. He had been in 2 active conflict zones. He had written letters home on behalf of soldiers who could not write anymore, and he had packed up the belongings of people he had eaten dinner with the night before, and he had done all of it without falling apart, because that was the job, and the job required you to stay functional. He sat at his desk in the small outpost on a scorched, dead planet and stared at the input board without typing anything for a long time. Rail drifted over eventually, as Rail always did, quiet for once, sitting on the edge of the secondary station. You read Ida's notes, he said. It was not a question. Darian did not answer. What are we going to do, Sarge? Rail asked. It was a simple question. The answer was not simple at all, because the answer involved regulations and tribunal procedures and interstellar politics and a formal communication from the Drivari Elder Council that had arrived in Voss's office that morning and was sitting in Darian's secure queue right now, flagged as urgent. He knew what the message said. Vossa had given him a summary. The Elder Council had been informed. They were not pleased. They wanted the hatchlings returned to the surface of Driven 4 immediately, to be replaced in the ruins in accordance with abandonment rights. They used careful diplomatic language that did not say what that meant plainly, but Darian was not unclear on what it meant. He looked at Ash. Ash looked back at him with those gold eyes that asked things without language. Figure it out, Darian said. He reached for the comms terminal and began to type. The message he sent to Vossa was not long. It was a request to formally respond to the Elder Council's communication at the upcoming scheduled Accord Regional Tribunal session. It cited 2 specific regulations. It requested that Vossa hold the Council's demand in abeyance until the Tribunal could hear a presentation. Vossa's reply came back in 4 minutes. It said, I will allow it. Do not make me regret this. Darian read it. Then he set the tablet down and looked over at Rail. Get Cole off the equipment. I need to run a diagnostic. Rail grinned. So we're figuring it out? We're figuring it out. From the desk beside him, Ash made a small sound. Not translated. Not needing to be. Darian reached over, without looking up from the terminal, and let Ash press that flat, narrow head against the back of his hand. Then he got to work. The tribunal screen was large enough to show 8 separate video feeds at once, which meant Darian could see all of them clearly. Vossa in the upper left, arranging his appendages with visible anxiety. 3 Accord Council representatives from different species, all of them arranged in careful diplomatic neutrality, and taking up the bottom half of the screen in a feed that dwarfed the others simply because of the camera angle needed to fit them in frame, 5 members of the Drivari Elder Council. They were enormous. Even through the screen, they were enormous. Ancient scarred scales the color of deep iron and burned copper. Eyes that had seen centuries. The elder speaker sat at the center of the 5, and his presence was the kind that made the air feel heavier even at a distance of several light years and a video compression algorithm. Cole had climbed onto Darian's shoulder approximately 4 minutes before the tribunal opened and declined to come down. He sat there now, balanced with the easy confidence of something that did not understand political consequence and was therefore completely unbothered by it. His dark scales caught the light from the monitor. His tail was wrapped loosely around Darian's arm for balance. Darian had decided not to fight it. Vossa opened the proceedings with the careful formality that Crawley brought to everything, summarizing the incident, the current status of the hatchlings, and the Elder Council's formal request for their return. He was precise, and he was fair, and Darien noted that Vasa very carefully did not express a personal opinion in any direction. That was a Crawley skill that Darien had always respected, the ability to present a problem without contaminating it with your own position. The elder speaker spoke next. His voice came through the translation system as deep and even as stone being split. He said the abandonment of war orphaned hatchlings was a matter of Drivari cultural law, which predated the Accord by several thousand years. He said that Accord Regulation 7C existed precisely because the Accord had agreed, at the time of Drivari membership, to respect this practice as internal clan matter. He said that the interference of an Accord soldier, however well-intentioned, represented a violation of that agreement and could not be permitted to stand as a precedent. He said all of this without cruelty. Darien noticed that there was no anger in the elder speaker's voice. Just wait. The weight of a tradition that was very old and that powerful people had built their entire understanding of honor around. One of the Accord Council representatives asked if Sergeant Cole wished to address the tribunal. Darien said yes. He did not have notes. He had thought about bringing notes and decided against it. Notes made it look like you needed to remind yourself of things, and he did not want to look like he needed reminding. He spoke for about 4 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not make any dramatic gestures, which was partly temperament and partly because Cole was still on his shoulder and dramatic gestures were inadvisable with a hatchling maintaining balance by a tail grip on your arm. He started with Regulation 2A of the Accord Peacekeeping Charter. He summarized it simply. Any Accord peacekeeping personnel who encounter a living being in medical distress within their operational zone are required to render available aid. Not invited to consider rendering aid. Not permitted to render aid at their discretion. Required. The regulation used that word specifically, and it did not include exemptions based on species cultural practice, because the drafters of Regulation 2A had understood that an injured being was an injured being regardless of what tradition surrounded it. He paused there to let that settle. Then he moved to Regulation 7C, which the Elder Council had cited. He said he had read it carefully. He said the regulation was clear and he respected it. And then he said, very plainly, that Regulation 7C applied specifically to hatchlings within the scope of clan care and clan cultural practice, meaning hatchlings that were under the authority of a clan at the time of contact. The abandoned hatchlings of Driven 4 were not under the authority of any clan. The Elder Council had formally withdrawn clan recognition from war orphan hatchlings. That was the entire mechanism of the abandonment practice. The clan released them. By the Elder Council's own definition, these 3 hatchlings had no clan. They were outside clan jurisdiction at the moment of abandonment, which meant Regulation 7C, the non-interference regulation that protected clan cultural practice, had no hatchlings to protect. There were no clan hatchlings present. There were only 3 living beings in medical distress in a peacekeeping operational zone. Regulation 2A applied. Regulation 7C did not. He stopped talking. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of beings who are very good at thinking all arrive at the same calculation at the same moment and find that the calculation comes out the same way no matter how they run it. The elder speaker looked at him through the screen. He looked for a long time. On Darien's shoulder, Cole shifted his weight slightly and made a small sound. When the elder speaker spoke, his voice was exactly the same as before, deep, even, measured. You argue well, human, he said. I argue correctly, elder, Darien said. Another silence. Longer this time. Then something happened that nobody in the room had expected. One of the other Drivari on the council, younger than the elder speaker, her scales a deep amber red, her bearing carrying the controlled tension of someone who had been waiting a long time to speak and was now choosing her moment, leaned forward. She said that she wished to add to the record. She said that the tradition of abandoning war-orphaned hatchlings was not, in truth, a tradition that many among the younger Drivari clans supported any longer. She said it had been a source of internal conflict for generations, that there were reformist clans who had been challenging it quietly within Drivari political structure for decades, without the standing to force a change in the Elder Council's position. She said that the human soldier's intervention had done something those internal voices had been trying to do for a very long time. It had forced the question out of the private rooms of clan politics and into a space where it had to be answered plainly. She did not say Darien was right. She did not call the tradition wrong, not in those exact words. She said, perhaps this intervention was not a violation. Perhaps it was the kind of blunder that reveals the thing we have been pretending not to see. After that, the tribunal recessed for deliberation. Voss's face on the upper left feed was carefully blank. The Accord Council representatives were speaking quietly to each other with their microphones muted. The Drivari feed cut out as the council moved to a closed session. Darien leaned back in his chair. Cole climbed down from his shoulder and sat on the desk, examining the monitor with the expression of a creature that had watched proceedings and found them adequate. Vossa came back on the line alone, the other feeds temporarily dark. You have either resolved this cleanly, Vossa said, or you have ignited a political crisis inside the Drivari Council structure that will take years to settle. Which one are you betting on, sir? Vossa arranged his appendages in a configuration Darien had come to read as something like reluctant respect. The former, he said. Humans are irritating enough to accidentally be correct. He paused. The amber-scaled council member, Elder Raya, has been pushing for reform of abandonment practice inside the Drivari Council for 11 years. You gave her the opening she needed. Darien said nothing. The deliberation will take at least 2 days, Vossa continued. In the meantime, the hatchlings stay where they are. I will handle the administrative holding. Thank you, sir. Vossa was quiet for a moment. Then, in a slightly different tone, the kind that meant the official portion of the conversation was over, the dark-scaled one. On your shoulder during the tribunal. Cole, sir. Is that a tactical assessment or a name? It's a name. Of course it is. Vossa's feed clicked off. Darien looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him and then looked at the blank screen and then looked back at Darien, apparently satisfied with the day's events. From the back of the outpost, Darien could hear Ida telling Flint to stop pulling at the medical supply storage and Rail laughing at something. The outpost was loud in a way it had not been 3 weeks ago. It was cluttered with things that had not been there before. Thermal blankets nested in corners, scratch marks on the lower portions of the equipment lockers, small-scale shaped smudge marks on the windows at exactly the height that a hatchling would press its nose against the glass to look at the dark outside. 2 days, Darien thought. He would wait 2 days. He reached over and gave Cole a very small, careful scratch behind the jaw ridge, which Cole tolerated with enormous dignity for approximately 3 seconds before leaning into it completely. Darien waited. 2 days became 4. 4 became 7. The deliberation stretched on, which Vossa said was not necessarily a bad sign, but was not necessarily a good sign either. It meant the Drivari Elder Council was divided, and a divided council did not move quickly. Darien's reassignment was 11 days away. He did not think about that number directly. He kept it somewhere in the back of his mind the way you kept all the difficult logistical problems, present but not pressing until they needed to be pressed. In the meantime, there was Cole. He had decided to teach Cole basic commands. Not because he thought Cole would be particularly receptive. Not because it had any formal purpose. Simply because Cole was sharp-minded and high energy and was going to find something to do with that intelligence regardless of whether it was something Darien wanted, and it was better to give a curious creature a direction than to spend your time undoing the directions it chose for itself. He started with sit. He spent one afternoon working on it. He would say the word, demonstrate by pressing gently on Cole's hindquarters until Cole was in a lowered position, then immediately give a piece of nutrient paste as a reward. Standard training logic. He had trained dogs before. He understood the framework. Cole learned sit in approximately 4 hours. He did not learn it correctly. When Cole heard the word, he would lower himself, but instead of folding his hindquarters under him the way a quadruped would, he would sort of compress all 4 limbs simultaneously in a way that put him closer to the ground without resembling any kind of sitting position a human would recognize. His wings half opened for balance. His tail went straight behind him. He looked, Rail said, like a table that had made a bad decision. He did it every single time, consistently, within 3 seconds of the command. Darien counted it. Rail documented it, because Rail had started keeping a daily log of hatchling developments that was, technically, a completely unofficial document with no place in the Accord peacekeeping administrative system, but which was also the most detailed record of Drivari hatchling behavioral development that had ever been compiled by anyone outside a Drivari research institution. Rill did not know this. He was just writing things down because they seemed worth remembering. Flint had begun sleeping across Ida's feet at night. This had happened gradually, incrementally, over the course of the first week. A few centimeters closer each evening, a little more of his weight settled against her ankles, until one morning Ida woke up and could not move without disturbing a sleeping hatchling and simply lay there for an extra 20 minutes rather than do so. She mentioned this to Darian in a tone that suggested she was reporting a minor logistical inconvenience. Darian did not say anything about it. They both understood what it meant. One evening Rail asked Darian a question that came from nowhere, the way Rail's questions often did. He would be quiet for a long time and then ask something that had apparently been sitting in him for days waiting for the right moment. "Did you ever want kids?" Darian did not answer immediately. He was doing a maintenance check on the perimeter equipment, and he kept doing it while he thought about how to handle the question. "I wanted a lot of things before my second deployment," he said finally. Rail nodded. He did not push further. Rail was better at reading the edges of conversations than people generally gave him credit for. Neither of them looked at the three hatchlings asleep in a pile on Darian's bunk, which had become the hatchlings' bunk in any practical sense because Darian had been sleeping on the supply room floor for 5 days. On the 8th day, a news item appeared in the Accord General Information Network. Darian did not look for it. Vasa sent it to him directly with a message that simply said, "This is becoming something larger." The item was not from a major network. It was a piece filed by a correspondent who covered Accord multi-species affairs for a mid-size information service that was popular among species that paid close attention to political shifts. The correspondent had clearly been following the tribunal situation from public records, because public tribunals were on the Accord record even when their deliberations were closed. The piece was factual. It described what had happened: a human peacekeeping sergeant, a routine sweep, 3 hatchlings in the ruins, the tribunal. It quoted Regulation 2A and Regulation 7C without getting them wrong, which was more than Darian had expected from general press. And then it noted, carefully, that the Drivari Elder Council had not ruled and that the delay suggested something more than a straightforward dismissal of the case. The responses to the piece were the thing Vasa wanted him to see. There were species in the Accord who had always found humans slightly baffling. Not dangerous. The early fear of that had mostly faded, but puzzling in a specific way. Humans were loud where they could have been quiet. They formed attachments to things that strategic logic suggested they should not bother with. They persisted past the point where the calculation stopped making obvious sense. Other species looked at this and categorized it in different ways depending on their own frameworks: irrational, inefficient, emotionally undisciplined, hard to predict. The response thread to the news item was the first time Darian had seen it categorized differently, at scale, in public. A Yinthari academic. The Yinthari were a slow, thoughtful species who studied other species' behavioral patterns the way some people studied weather. Posted a long analysis. Darian read it through Voss's translation summary. The academic said, essentially, that human emotional persistence was not a failure of calculation. It was a different kind of calculation. One that ran on variables that other species tended to exclude from their models. The value of a single life, the weight of a look from something that needed help, the long-term strategic cost of walking past a thing that needed you to stop. The academic called it, in Yinthari, a word that translated roughly as weighted compassion. Compassion that was not soft. Compassion that had load-bearing capacity. There was a long response thread beneath the analysis. Darian read some of it and stopped reading when the feeling in his chest got to be something he did not have a comfortable category for. On day 9, a communication arrived from a Drivari reformist clan. Not through official channels, through Vasa's personal network, sent quietly, flagged as unofficial inquiry. The clan leader, a female called Elder Rai's younger cousin, stated that her clan had resources to care for orphan hatchlings and had been waiting for legal standing to act openly. She did not ask for anything. She simply said, "If it becomes possible, we are ready." Darian read it 3 times. He did not tell Rael or Ida yet. He did not want to say anything that might not be real. He had learned a long time ago that hope was something you held carefully until it had enough ground under it to stand on. He filed it away and kept waiting. On the morning of day 11, Ash was sitting on the windowsill when the pale light of Dreven Ivy's dawn came through the outpost's single east-facing window. Just sitting there, watching the sky change color. The sulfur-yellow clouds were moving slowly. The twin moons were down. For a few minutes, in that early light, the planet did not look like a war zone. It just looked like a place. Darian stood in the doorway between the sleep area and the main room and watched Ash watch the sky. After a while, Ash turned and looked at him. The gold eyes caught the dawn light and held it. Darian was 11 days from the end of his posting. He did not know yet how any of this was going to resolve. He knew what he wanted. He knew what the Reform clan had offered. He did not know if the Elder Council was going to make it possible or if he was going to have to go back to Vasa with another argument and another set of regulations and another careful, stubborn refusal to accept the first answer. But that was tomorrow's problem. This morning, a hatchling was watching the sun come up, and the light was making its scales look less dull than they had in the ruins, more like what they were going to be when they were fully grown and healthy and somewhere safe, bright and dark at the same time, the color of deep water just before it catches the sun. Darian went and made himself some terrible Outpost coffee. He brought his mug to the window and stood beside Ash, and they both watched the sky go from dark to pale to the bruised purple-green of a Dreven morning. There were worse ways to wait. That afternoon, Vasa called with a different tone than usual. The deliberation had ended. Vasa did not make him wait for the news. The Drevari Elder Council has reached a ruling, he said. It is not the ruling I expected. Darian held the comms handset and did not say anything. They have formally recognized all 3 hatchlings as wards of the Accord. The legal category has existed in the Accord Charter for 230 years and has been applied to non-Drevari beings 11 times. It has never been applied to a Drevari. Until today. Vasa paused. Elder Raya cast the deciding vote. She brought 3 other council members with her. The elder speaker abstained rather than vote against. Darian let out a slow breath. What does ward status mean for them practically? It means they fall under Accord protection. They cannot be returned to the ruins. Their care becomes an Accord responsibility, which means resources, which means legal standing for any Drevari reformist clan that offers to take them in. Another pause. I understand there has been at least one such offer already. There has. Then I suggest you contact them. A beat. You will need to begin transfer arrangements. Your posting ends in 2 days. 2 days. Darian set the handset down and sat still for a moment with his hands flat on the desk. Then he stood up and went to find the others. He told them plainly, in the same way he told them everything. No build-up, no performance, just the facts in order. Rail's face went through about 6 different expressions in 5 seconds before settling somewhere around relief, so intense it looked almost like grief. Ida stood very still for a moment with her arms crossed, and then she uncrossed them and exhaled and said, "Good," in a voice that was one of the quietest things Darian had ever heard her say. Cole, who was on the equipment locker again, looked at their faces and made a sound that may or may not have been the Drevari equivalent of a question, but which none of them attempted to translate. The transfer contact for the reformist clan was a young Drevari named Saville, small by Drevari adult standards. Her scales a warm, burnished copper. Her speech through the translation sweet, quick, and precise, and very clear about practical matters. She arrived on the Accord resupply shuttle the next morning along with 2 older clan members who were experienced in hatchling care and who spent the first 2 hours doing health assessments and environment checks with an efficiency that made Ida briefly competitive and then respectful. Saville told Darian, when they had a moment outside while the others worked, that Elder Raya had been fighting for this for 11 years. That there were 37 reformist clans across Drevari settled space who had been ready to take war orphaned hatchlings for years, waiting for legal standing that the Elder Council had refused to give them. She said it calmly, without bitterness, the way people talk about things they have waited a long time to say. She said, one soldier stopping was all it needed. Darian said he didn't think it was that simple. Saville said no, but it started with that. The last morning was not dramatic. Darian had packed his kit the night before, which was the practical thing to do, and he had done it carefully and efficiently, which was his default mode for things he did not want to think too hard about. He was done packing in 20 minutes. Then he sat on the edge of what had become, technically, the hatchling's bunk, with his bag on the floor beside him, and did not go to sleep. Cole found him at some point in the early hours and climbed up next to him. Flint came shortly after, pressing against his ribs. Ash was last, climbing into his lap with the calm certainty of a creature that had decided this was where it was going to be and saw no reason to justify the decision. He sat with them for a long time in the dark. He did not say anything profound. He was a sergeant, not a poet, and the things he felt did not have the kind of shape that fit into words neatly. What he had to say was simpler than anything profound. He told them they were going somewhere good. He told them the people coming for them knew what they were doing and would take care of them properly, better than a peacekeeping outpost with limited supplies and 3 soldiers who were figuring it out as they went. He told them the question had an answer. The real question. The one that Ash had asked him with gold eyes on the first night in the ruins. The one Flint had asked by pressing against Ida's knee. The one Cole had asked by opening the supply cabinet and dragging out a thermal blanket and sitting in the middle of the floor as if to say, "Someone should see this. Someone should know I am here." Yes, he told them. Someone wanted them. Not only Savile and the Reformist clan, who were real and prepared and ready. But more than that, the question of whether anyone would ever want them had been answered in front of an Accord Tribunal and a Drivari Elder Council and a growing number of beings across the Accord network who had read a news item about a soldier who stopped walking during a routine sweep and done what seemed obvious to him. The answer was yes. It had always been going to be yes, once the question was loud enough to hear. Ash pressed its head against Darian's chest and stayed there. He put one hand over its back, very gently, and stayed. In the morning, the transfer went smoothly. Savile and her people were professional and kind and patient with the hatchlings, and Cole inspected all 3 of them thoroughly before deciding they were acceptable, which Rail said was Cole's version of giving approval. Flint stayed close to Ida until the last moment, and then walked to Savile's side with the steady deliberateness of a creature that understood something was changing and had decided to meet it with dignity. Ash was last, and it stood at the outpost door and looked back at Darian for a long time. Darian crouched down to its level, the same way he had in the ruins that first night. Small and still. Ash walked back to him, touched the back of his hand once with one small foreclaw, and then turned and walked to Savile. Rail was very interested in something on the horizon for the next few minutes. Ida was making notes in her medical log with great focus. Darian stood up straight and watched the transfer shuttle lift off from the Driven 4 surface and become a bright point against the bruised purple sky and then disappear. He picked up his kit bag. They shipped out that afternoon. 6 months later, a routine administrative report filed by Vasa to the Accord Peacekeeping Oversight Committee contained, in its appendix, a single paragraph that he had almost cut for length and then decided to leave in. It noted that the 3 Drivari hatchlings transferred to Reformist Clan Savile were in good health and developing well ahead of all physiological projections. It noted that the eldest of the 3, a bold, coal-scaled male, had demonstrated early aptitude for problem-solving and had already learned 12 commands, all of which he performed in ways that were consistent but structurally incorrect, a behavioral pattern which his current caretakers found difficult to explain but had decided to count anyway. It noted, further, that applications for ward status from War Orphan Drivari hatchlings had increased by 340% in the 6 months following the ruling. That 37 reformist clans were now operating openly and legally. That Elder Raya had formally proposed a review of abandonment practice to the full Elder Council, the first such proposal in recorded Drivari history to have a realistic chance of changing policy. The Accord Oversight Committee discussed the paragraph briefly. One delegate asked what had set all of this in motion. Another summarized the incident for the record. A peacekeeping sergeant on a routine perimeter sweep had heard a sound in the ruins of a dead colony and had turned around and gone back to find out what it was. A Crawley delegate, not Vasa, a different one, older, who had been in Accord politics for 40 years and had seen a great number of things, said quietly that she thought the most interesting thing about humans was not their technology or their military capacity or their economic growth rate. Someone asked what it was. Then, she said, they have a very hard time walking past things. Nobody in the committee room argued with that. Nobody could think of a reason to.